Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from the Hometow Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Wobblies. Hello there. Did you ever hear the story of the Wobbly invasion of 1911 and how the embattled citizens turned out and organized for the defense of Grays Harbor? Maybe you lived through those exciting days when Mayor Parks of Aberdeen called for volunteers and 500 Aberdeen men stood up. When Hoquiam's Citizens Committee of 3 organized the citizens of that city for the protection of their homes. Well, if you've never heard of the story of the social upheaval that rocked Grays Harbor back before World War I and the political war that was waged by its citizens against the outside enemy that tried to bore in and take over, this page from the Hometown Scrapbook tonight may appeal to you as a page well worth discovering. Now, after Dick Crombie has taken his customary few seconds for a word from our sponsors, we'll be back to tell you of the IWWs and the political war of 1911. I don't imagine that there are many listeners tonight who have heard of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. It was an idealistic and militant organization of socialist enthusiasts. To give it a polite description, it pushed itself forward as a defender of the working man, and it was described by its opposition as a collection of anarchists. Its real composition and real purpose, like most things, was probably somewhere between. And in the early years of the century, the IWWs were regarded by most folks about as average Americans regarded communists today, and with some apprehension and some curiosity and no great desire to have them around. But we're not going to use the scrapbook as a soapbox to discuss the merits or detriments of various social improvements or political movements. We want to dig out the musty pages of the story of what happened on Grays Harbor in the days of the IWW and how it affected the lives of those who live here. It was early in the 1900s when the IWW opened an Aberdeen headquarters and began to organize their movement. Their principal method was the street corner meeting, in which a long-haired and fanatical party member, with the feverish enthusiasm of a true zealot, would fire up an audience with a combination of class hatred and political dogma, then pass out bales of literature that had a Marxist slant and a radical flavor. From time to time, as the Wobblies, that was the popular name for them, as the Wobblies grew in strength, they would cause trouble at the sawmills and logging camps of Grays Harbor. It was a futile field in which to work. While the wages paid in Grays Harbor plants were about average for the Northwest lumber industries, like most wages and working conditions of the time, there were places where improvement could be made. But the methods and tactics of the Wobblies were such as to make the arbitration difficult, and when the fiercely zealous Wobblies butted into the labor dispute, it was soon out of hand. And the organization made problems for the operators, complicated things for the business people, and made, when everything was boiled down, very few friends among the workers. Aberdeen was the first to take some action to restrict them. The city council passed an ordinance restricting public meetings for political purposes on the streets. Councilman John Miles penned an ordinance and Mayor W.J. Parks gave it his support. It sailed through the council with not a dissenting vote, and when the meeting was over, it was profusely shortened to permit members of the council to attend Gertrude Hoffman's performance at the Grand Theater. W.A. Thorne, the IWW organizer of the town, challenged the mayor and his council in the lobby of the city's new city hall and proceeded to give them a verbal lashing. That is, he did until Councilman Miles swung with a right haymaker and stretched the wobbly leader his length on the official floor. That was the stormy evening of October 12, 1911. But that was only the beginning. With the ordinance in effect, the Wobblies proceeded to make deliberate efforts to get into Aberdeen's jail. A.W. Thorne, with his right eye neatly blackened from his encounter with Councilman Miles, took his unusual post at the corner of Heron and G Street and began his tirade on changing the shape of the world, and Police Chief Templeton ordered his officers to bring him in. No sooner had Thorne been lodged behind bars than James Train, his right-hand man, took up the torch. He appeared in the street at the same spot and began to belabor the national administration and local administration and mill owners and business folk and union officials and local police. And within a half an hour, he was incarcerated in a cell alongside his captain. The following night, 3 more lesser lights were taken in, and the city's jail was doing a big business. When the 5 Wobblies were sharing the city's hospitality, an IWW publication was circulated stating that if Aberdeen tried to continue enforcement of the ordinance, the IWW would bring free speech to the citizens by force, or destroy the harbor and see grass growing in the streets, if it took 20 years to do it. Those were fighting words. But to put them into effect, the Seattle headquarters of the IWW sent to Grays Harbor their head rabble-rouser, W.S. Fisher. As the citizens of the harbor were concerned, the Wobblies were inactive. But the next edition of their newspaper, published in Publisher Seattle, carried the interesting story. It said in part, "We had a successful meeting at City Hall despite rain. We'll send us 100 more workers. We don't think the 100 who are already coming will be enough. Fellow worker train is here. The things are coming our way. Get the workers here by the end of the week for sure." It was a report to the organization from Fisher, but it also served as a warning to Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis. Grays Harbor was about to be invaded by the Wobbly Goon Squad. Some of the industrial plants took precautions to protect their premises from invasion. At Cosmopolis, the sprawling Grays Harbor Commercial Company, which had been under fire for years for its labor relations program, built a tall wooden fence along one end of its property. It was just before Thanksgiving that year that the new voice of the IWW took over the corner of Heron and G Street and tried to goad the city into jailing him. Fisher, Windy Fisher, as he was dubbed, as an experienced infighter, he wanted to close in on the authorities. His plan, as it was diagnosed by Mayor Parks and the councilman, was to pack the jail with IWWs and then demand jury trials. They would make capital of the publicity and exhaust the city's financial resources in long and involved legal manipulation. Chief Templeton ordered his patrols to ignore the demonstration, but Fisher had planned ahead. When he found that he could not get himself arrested, he arranged the crowd, which grew to several hundred, and then produced a march on Aberdeen's jail to free the quintet of previous speakers who were still cooling their heels in jail. But the word of the march traveled ahead of them, and when they appeared before the new brick building, about 20 vocal adepts of Fisher's policies and several hundred curious onlookers, that they met with their fire hoses and were turned back. That night, down the block from the hall, on the corner of Arctic Fur Company's, where the now stands, Windy Fisher announced his invasion. "They are coming by the thousands," he ranted. "We'll take over Grays Harbor." I'll tell you what happens now after a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsor. The next noon, Mayor Parks met with the executive committee of the Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce. It was in the old Washington Hotel. The problem was how to counter the IWW tactics. At the same time in Hoquiam, the Citizens Committee organized, headed by P.J. Morant, Arthur Bridges, and Dr. H.C. Watkins. It listed a membership of 50 and it announced it was ready to follow Aberdeen's lead in the matter. But since any invasion from outside must come through Aberdeen, the only route of approach to Hoquiam, the brunt of work fell on the Aberdeen Committee. and the Chamber of Commerce Committee of 12 was not what Mayor Parks wanted. "I want every loyal man in this town in line with us," he announced, and called a meeting of the Aberdeen Elks Temple at 3 o'clock. And they came. The clerks and the doctors and the butchers and the lawyers, the mill operators and most of the crews. The little sawdust town was practically closed when 3 o'clock rolled up around. 500 of them packed the Elks Temple, and hundreds more overflowed into the street. The mayor laid the cards on the table. "They are coming down from Seattle with their army," he announced. "The governor has offered the National Guard. I told him that we can handle our own problem. Can we, men?" The assembled townfolks roared their assurance. Then the mayor called for volunteers to be sworn in as special police officers for the duration of the emergency. Every man in the hall stood up. For the moment, the political differences, the social, economic, racial, and radical things that had separated the men of the little lumber town into brackets and cliques, caste and stratus had dropped away. One of them told me years later, every man there was proud to be a resident of this community. That night at 6 o'clock, they were sworn in, and then 500 Aberdeen citizens to boot. They were armed with axe handles and hickory wheel spokes, and they had their first job to attend to. During the day, the army of the IWWs had drifted into town, mostly entrants. They had ridden the freight trains to the harbor, and they were now gathering in growing crowds in front of the organization's headquarters on Lower D Street. Some of their members hurried through the town with handbills hastily printed announcing a mass meeting at the Empire Theater at 7 p.m. But the citizen volunteers were ready. The mayor started action by closing all saloons right after 6. Then he seized the Empire Theater and posted guards along the street. He closed the downtown streets and posted guards at all corners. The town was in the hands of the embattled citizens. Anyone wearing a red badge, the sign of the IWWW, was arrested. By midnight, the city jail bulged with 25 of the out-of-town agitators, and at midnight, the citizens acted. They left guards at all main points in the city, and the remainder, nearly 400, marched to jail and took prisoners. Herding them before them, they moved towards the eastern limits of the town, out east Wishkah Street beyond the bridge to the base of Dabney Hill, and here the committee stopped. From a slab cart appropriated for the occasion, they rationed each of the Wobblies 2 loaves of bread, then lined them up. Mayor Parks and others spoke briefly. The grist of it was, "Get out of Grays Harbor and stay out. The next time you return, you won't be so hospitable." And the advance guard of what was to be the Wobbly Army trudged off up the MP tracks towards carrying their loaves of bread. And right here I want to make room for Dick Crombie and a few words from our sponsors. Well, the IWW menace was gone. Not for good. The sheriffs of Montesano and Elma authorities were warned to keep delegations on the move. But they stopped in Montesano the next day, where they were met with reinforcements coming down from Seattle. It is an indication of the send-off that they were receiving from the Aberdeen citizens, and they did not try to return, but they asked to talk to Mayor. Mayor Parks, accompanied by L.G. Humbarger, went to parley with them. This time, Max Korn and Adam Schubert spoke for the invaders. They asked only for the same right of public assembly that were granted the Salvation Army. The mayor invited the spokesman to come to the harbor and address the Citizens Committee. About 100 turned out to hear the 2 who represented themselves as members of the Socialist Party and disclaim any connection with the IWW, which they branded as an anarchist organization that would rule by violence. The committee cheered them. Then, when they got around to the subject of public meetings, the matter was referred to the Committee of 25, which said emphatically no. The issue was settled. The whole Northwest applauded Grays Harbor's handling of its IWW problem. C.R. Chase, president of the Washington State Federation of Labor, said the citizens had taken the right course. Nothing, he said, about the IWWS was in common with the cause of organized labor. But the IWWs were not whipped. They had placed a curse on Grays Harbor, and the next spring they came back to take a hand in Harbor's industrial revolution that closed every woodworking plant in the harbor, brought riots and disorder that were echoed all over the Northwest. But that's a story for another time, and we'll find it again when we sit down to read another story from your Grays Harbor and mine Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.